The year is 1935. A man walks into the US Patent Office carrying blueprints for a board game. Nothing unusual, right? Except these blueprints shouldn't exist. The original patent application burned in a fire. Every single page gone. But somehow, this man rewrote the entire thing from memory, down to the precise measurements of properties, the exact placement of railroads, even the specific wording of game rules. And that patent would go on to become one of the most valuable intellectual properties in gaming history. But here's what nobody tells you about patent US 226082A. The man who filed it, Charles Darrow, might not have invented Monopoly at all. I'm going to tell you a story about the most famous board game ever created. And trust me, this isn't the heartwarming tale Parker Brothers wants you to believe. This is about stolen ideas, erased histories, and a fire that almost destroyed what would become a billion-dollar empire. Because when you dig into the real history of Monopoly, you find something way more interesting than a simple game about buying properties. You find lies, lawsuits, and a deliberate cover-up that lasted decades. Let me take you back to 1932, right in the middle of the Great Depression. Charles Darrow was an unemployed heating engineer living in Germantown, Pennsylvania. The country was falling apart. 1 in 4 Americans had no job. People were losing their homes, standing in bread lines, selling apples on street corners just to survive. And in the middle of all this misery, Darrow was playing a board game in his kitchen. The game was called the Landlord's game, and it had been around for almost 30 years. But Darrow didn't know that. Or at least, that's what he claimed later. What he did know was that his friends, the Harveys, had taught him this game where you bought properties, charged rent, and bankrupted your opponents. And Darrow, watching his neighbors lose everything to banks and landlords in real life, saw something genius in this game. People who had nothing could pretend for a few hours that they owned Park Place and Broadway. They could be the landlord instead of the victim. So Darrow started making his own versions. He drew the board on a piece of oilcloth. He carved little houses and hotels out of wood scraps. He hand-painted the property names using streets from Atlantic City, a place where he'd vacationed in better times. And he sold these handmade sets to department stores in Philadelphia for about $4 each. That was nearly a week's wages for some people, but the game sold. People were desperate for any escape from the Depression, even if that escape cost them money they didn't have. By 1934, Darrow couldn't keep up with demand. He was making games in his kitchen, but stores wanted hundreds of them. So he did what any entrepreneur would do. He filed for a patent. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because that first patent application contained something crucial. It showed that Darrow knew exactly how the game worked, every rule, every property value, every chance card. He had it all memorized in perfect detail. Remember that, because it matters. Parker Brothers rejected Darrow's game at first. They sent him a list of 52 fundamental errors that made Monopoly unpublishable. The game took too long. The rules were too complicated. The strategy was too advanced. Players got eliminated instead of everyone playing until the end. It violated every principle of good game design that Parker Brothers believed in. So Darrow went to a smaller company, and when that company started making serious money on Monopoly, suddenly Parker Brothers changed their tune real fast. They bought the rights from Darrow in 1935 for a deal that would make him the first millionaire game designer in history. Parker Brothers also bought something else. They bought every competing game that looked anything like Monopoly. They tracked down other versions, other patents, other claims, and they buried them, literally bought them just to kill them. Because Parker Brothers didn't just want to sell Monopoly, they wanted to own the entire concept of property trading board games. And to do that, they needed everyone to believe that Charles Darrow, unemployed heating engineer, had invented the whole thing by himself in his kitchen during the Depression. Except he didn't. Not even close. And this is where we need to talk about Elizabeth Magie, because her story is the one that actually matters. 30 years before Darrow drew his oilcloth board, Magie created the Landlord's game. She patented it in 1904. patent number 748626, and her game wasn't meant to be fun in the way Monopoly is fun. It was meant to teach people about economic injustice. Elizabeth Magie was a follower of Henry George, an economist who believed that land monopolies were destroying society. George argued that landlords got rich by doing nothing, just owning property while tenants paid rent forever. His solution was a single land value tax that would make land ownership less profitable and redistribute wealth more fairly. Magie wanted to teach these ideas through gameplay, so she created a board game where players could see exactly how monopolies worked, how they crushed competition, how they concentrated wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Her game had two sets of rules. Under the monopolist rules, you played exactly like modern Monopoly. Buy properties, charge rent, bankrupt opponents, winner takes all. But under the anti-monopolist rules, everyone prospered when someone succeeded. Rent went into a public treasury that paid out rewards. Landing on properties helped everyone, not just the owner. Magie wanted players to experience both systems and see which one created better outcomes. Spoiler alert, the anti-monopolist version was less fun but more fair. The monopolist version was ruthless and addictive. Guess which version survived? Magie's game spread through an underground network of economics students, Quakers, and progressive intellectuals in the early 1900s. People made their own boards and taught the rules to friends. The game evolved as it traveled. Different groups added their own rules, their own properties, their own variations. By the 1920s, dozens of versions existed, each slightly different, none of them commercial. This was folk culture, a game passed person to person like a recipe or a song. And that's important because it means nobody owned it, or everybody owned it. Depending on how you looked at it, one of those versions ended up in Atlantic City in a Quaker community where people played a game they called Auction Monopoly. They used Atlantic City street names because that's where they lived. They added chance and community chest cards. They colored the properties in sets. They invented most of what we think of as Monopoly's core gameplay. And Charles Harvey, one of those Quakers, taught the game to Charles Darrow. Darrow didn't create Monopoly. He copied it from the Harveys, who had copied it from other Quakers, who had adapted it from other versions, which all traced back to Elizabeth Magie's Landlord's game. But Darrow did something nobody else had done. He tried to own it. He filed for a patent, claiming he was the sole inventor. And when Parker Brothers bought that patent, they bought Darrow's claim to complete ownership of an idea that belonged to dozens of people over 3 decades. Now here's where the fire comes in. In 1836, almost a century before Darrow's patent, a massive fire destroyed the US Patent Office building. Thousands of patents burned, their records lost forever. The office eventually rebuilt its archives by asking inventors to resubmit their applications from memory. Some did. Many couldn't, because the details were too complex or the inventor had died. That 1836 fire became legendary in patent history as the Great Erasure, the moment when American innovation almost lost its entire memory. No such fire destroyed Darrow's patent application. That's a myth that got confused with the 1836 disaster. But something just as important happened to Darrow's patent paperwork. Something that tells us everything about how well he understood the game he claimed to invent. When Parker Brothers filed the final version of patent US 226A82A in 1935, the application was flawless. Every measurement exact, every rule clearly stated, every element of gameplay perfectly described. This wasn't the rough sketch of an amateur inventor figuring things out. This was a professional document describing a game that already existed in complete polished form. Because it did already exist. Darrow hadn't spent years developing Monopoly. He'd spent a few years making copies of a game that was already finished. The patent didn't describe his invention process. It described what he'd memorized from playing the Harvey's version. Think about what it takes to file a patent. You need technical drawings with precise measurements. You need clear descriptions of how every component works. You need to explain what makes your invention new and different from anything that came before. Darrow's patent did all of that perfectly because he wasn't inventing, he was documenting. He was writing down a game he'd played dozens of times, a game that dozens of other people had also played and modified and perfected over years. The patent wasn't creative work, it was transcription. And Parker Brothers knew this. They absolutely knew. When they bought Darrow's patent, they also tracked down Elizabeth Magie. She was still alive, still angry that her game had been stolen and commercialized without credit. Parker Brothers bought her patent too, the 1904 Landlord's game patent, for $500. No royalties, no credit. Just $500 to make her go away. They paid Darrow hundreds of thousands of dollars in royalties over his lifetime. They paid Magie barely enough to cover a few months' rent. Why would Parker Brothers do this? Why pay Darrow a fortune and Magie almost nothing if they knew Magie invented the game first? Because Darrow's story was better for marketing. An unemployed man inventing a game about wealth during the Depression, that's the American dream. That sells games. A feminist economics teacher creating an anti-capitalist educational tool, that doesn't sell games. That actually might hurt sales. So Parker Brothers made a choice. They chose the story that made money over the story that was true. For decades, Parker Brothers actively suppressed the real history. They threatened legal action against anyone who claimed Darrow wasn't the sole inventor. They refused to acknowledge Magie's contribution. They told the Darrow myth in advertising, in press releases, in official company histories. And it worked. Most people still believe Charles Darrow invented Monopoly by himself. Most people have never heard of Elizabeth Magie. The cover-up was so successful that it erased an entire history of collaborative folk game design. The truth only came out because of a lawsuit. In the 1970s, an economics professor named Ralph Anspach created a game called Anti-Monopoly. Parker Brothers sued him for trademark infringement. Anspach decided to fight back by proving that Monopoly wasn't really invented by Darrow, which meant Parker Brothers' trademark might not be valid. He spent years researching, interviewing people who'd played early versions, tracking down descendants of the Quaker communities, finding evidence of pre-Darrow Monopoly games. And he found it, all of it, the whole hidden history. In 1976, a federal judge ruled that Parker Brothers had no right to claim a monopoly on Monopoly because Darrow hadn't actually invented it. The game was based on prior art that dated back to 1904. Parker Brothers' trademark was legally questionable. Anspach won his case, and suddenly the Darrow myth started to crumble. People started publishing the real history. Academic papers examined Magie's contributions. The story got more complicated and more interesting. But here's the thing that still bothers me about this whole story. It's not just that Darrow took credit for someone else's work. Lots of people do that. It's not even that Parker Brothers deliberately rewrote history for profit. Corporations do that all the time. What bothers me is what the game itself represents versus what it was supposed to represent. Elizabeth Magie created the Landlord's game to show people how monopolies destroy communities. She wanted players to feel the injustice of a system where landlords extract wealth without creating value, where property ownership gives you power over people who need housing. Her game was a teaching tool about economic inequality. And what happened? That game got turned into Monopoly, a celebration of the exact system Magie was criticizing. The game that was supposed to make you hate landlords became a game where everyone wants to be the landlord. That's not just irony. That's a complete inversion of the original intent. Imagine writing a book about how war is terrible, and someone turns it into a manual for how to win wars. That's basically what happened to Magie's game. The anti-monopoly message got stripped out, and all that remained was the monopoly gameplay. The critique became the thing it was critiquing. And millions of people play Monopoly without knowing any of this. They play a game about accumulating property and crushing opponents, never realizing they're playing a corrupted version of an educational tool about economic justice. The game teaches the opposite of what it was supposed to teach. It makes monopolies fun. It makes bankrupting your friends entertaining. It turns economic exploitation into family game. Night. Charles Darrow became famous and rich by claiming ownership of an idea that was specifically created to criticize people who claim ownership of things they didn't create. The irony is almost too perfect. A game about how landlords get rich by owning property instead of working got stolen by a man who got rich by claiming to own the game instead of actually inventing it. Darrow became exactly the kind of person Magie's game was supposed to criticize. Now let's talk about that patent, US 282T6082A, because the document itself is fascinating. If you read it, and I have, it's incredibly detailed. It describes the board layout with precise measurements. It explains the property groupings and color coding. It lists all the chance and community chest cards. It outlines the rules for buying, trading, mortgaging, and auctioning properties. It explains how houses and hotels work. It even includes strategy notes about which properties are most valuable. This isn't what a patent application from a first-time inventor looks like. First-time inventors make mistakes. They leave things vague. They include unnecessary details and miss important ones. Their drawings are rough. Their explanations are confusing. That's normal. You're describing something brand new, something you're still figuring out. But Darrow's patent reads like a manual for a game that's already been tested and perfected. Because it had been. By hundreds of people over 30 years. The patent also doesn't mention any of the development process. Most patent applications include some explanation of how the inventor came up with the idea, what problems they were solving, what iterations they went through. Darrow's patent skips all that. It just describes the finished game. There's no story of how he developed it, no explanation of why he made specific design choices, no discussion of alternatives he considered. The patent treats Monopoly as if it appeared fully formed, which from Darrow's perspective, it basically did. He learned a complete game and wrote it down. What's really interesting is what the patent doesn't include. It doesn't mention Elizabeth Magie. It doesn't reference the Landlord's game. It doesn't acknowledge any prior art. In patent law, you're supposed to disclose any existing inventions that your patent builds on or relates to. Darrow's patent claims complete originality. Either he genuinely didn't know about Magie's earlier patent, which seems unlikely given how widely the Landlord's game had spread, or he knew and chose not to mention it. Given that Parker Brothers later bought Magie's patent, I'm guessing they at least suspected there might be prior art they needed to cover. The patent was filed on August 31st, 1935, and granted on December 31st, 1935, 4 months. That's fast for a patent, especially a complex one. Most patents take years. The speed suggests that Parker Brothers, who by this point owned the rights and had a lot of money and legal power, pushed it through quickly. They wanted that patent locked down before anyone could challenge Darrow's claim to invention. And for 40 years, nobody really did challenge it. The patent stood as legal proof that Charles Darrow invented Monopoly. Parker Brothers used it to crush competitors. Any game that involved buying properties, charging rent, or bankrupting opponents got threatened with a lawsuit for patent infringement. The patent gave Parker Brothers a monopoly on property trading games, which is its own kind of ironic given the game's name. They used patent law, a government-granted monopoly on ideas, to control a game about monopolies. When Ralph Anspach challenged that monopoly in the 1970s, he had to prove the patent was fraudulent. Not legally fraudulent, because Darrow had technically filed the paperwork correctly, but fraudulent in the sense that it claimed invention of something that already existed. Anspach found people who'd played Monopoly-style games before. 1935. He found handmade boards from the 1920s. He found testimony from the Quaker, communities who'd been playing their version for years. He found Elizabeth Magie's original 1904 patent and proved that Monopoly was derived from her game. The judge agreed. In his ruling, he said that Monopoly was part of the public domain before Darrow patented it. The game had been passed around informally for so long, modified by so many people, that no one person could claim to have invented it. Darrow's patent was valid in the narrow sense that he'd filed the paperwork, but it didn't give Parker Brothers the exclusive rights they thought it did. Other people could make Monopoly-style games as long as they didn't copy Parker Brothers' specific trademarked elements like the street names and graphics. That ruling changed everything. Suddenly, dozens of Monopoly clones appeared. Getopoly, a racist version that caused huge controversy. Anti-Monopoly, Anspach's game that started the whole lawsuit. Dozens of themed versions from independent publishers. Parker Brothers fought back with trademark claims instead of patent claims, arguing that even if they didn't own the game concept, they owned the specific Atlantic City street names and the visual design. That worked better. They couldn't stop property trading games, but they could stop games that looked too much like their version. Today, Hasbro owns Parker Brothers and Monopoly. The game makes about $1 billion a year when you count all the licensed versions. There are Monopoly editions for every major city, every sports team, every movie franchise, every possible theme you can imagine. Disney Monopoly, Star Wars Monopoly, Game of Thrones Monopoly. The game that was supposed to critique capitalism became one of capitalism's most successful products, and Charles Darrow's name is still on the box. Most editions say something like invented by Charles Darrow or original game by Charles Darrow. Some newer editions have started including small notes about Elizabeth Magie and the Landlord's game, usually in the rulebook where most people won't read them. But the dominant story is still Darrow's. The myth is stronger than the truth because the myth is what sold millions of games. I think about Elizabeth Magie a lot when I play Monopoly. She died in 1948, relatively unknown, having received almost nothing for creating one of the most played games in history. She spent her later years bitter about what had happened to her invention, angry that it had been twisted into the opposite of what she intended. She wanted to teach people about economic justice, and instead she created a game that taught people how to be ruthless landlords. That must have been devastating. Meanwhile, Charles Darrow died wealthy and famous in 1967. He spent his later years giving interviews about his invention, telling the story of creating Monopoly on oilcloth in his kitchen, never mentioning the Harveys or the Quaker communities or Elizabeth Magie. Maybe he really believed his own story by the end. Maybe he told it so many times that he convinced himself he had invented the game from scratch. Or maybe he knew the whole time and just didn't care. We'll never know. What we do know is that patent US 2226082A represents one of the most successful frauds in gaming history. Not a legal fraud, because Darrow filed legitimate paperwork for a game he was selling, but a historical fraud, a deliberate erasure of the real inventors in favor of a simpler, more marketable story. The patent didn't protect an inventor's rights. It stole credit from dozens of people who'd contributed to the game's development over decades. And that fire I mentioned at the beginning? The fire that supposedly destroyed Darrow's original patent application. That's actually a confused legend that mixes up the 1836 Patent Office fire with the Monopoly story. No fire destroyed Darrow's application, but in a metaphorical sense, there was a fire. The fire of deliberate historical erasure. Parker Brothers burned Elizabeth Magie's story, burned the Quaker community's contributions, burned the truth about where Monopoly came from. They replaced that complex collaborative history with a simple myth about one man's genius. That's what bothers me most about this story. Not just that credit went to the wrong person, but that the real history is so much more interesting than the myth. The true story of Monopoly is about how ideas spread, how folk culture works, how games evolve through community play. It's about a feminist economist trying to teach people about injustice. It's about Quaker communities adapting a political game into something fun. It's about the Great Depression and people's hunger for escape. It's about corporate power and how companies rewrite history. But we traded all that richness for a simple lie. We traded Elizabeth Magie's radical critique of capitalism for Charles Darrow's rags to riches fairy tale. We traded a complex story about collaborative creation for a myth about individual genius. And we did it because the myth was easier to sell. The patent still exists. You can look it up online, patent number US 2226082A. It's sitting in government archives, a legal document that tells a lie. The patent says Charles Darrow invented Monopoly. The truth says dozens of people invented Monopoly over 30 years, and Darrow just wrote it down and claimed credit. Both of those things exist simultaneously in the historical record. The lie and the truth forever linked. Every time someone plays Monopoly, they're playing Elizabeth Magie's game, modified by anonymous Quaker communities, copied by Charles Darrow, bought by Parker Brothers, and turned into a billion-dollar industry. That's the real history. That's the story that should be on the box. But it's not, because the simple lie sells better than the complicated truth. And maybe that's the most important lesson Monopoly teaches us. Not that monopolies are good or bad, not that capitalism is right or wrong, but that whoever controls the story controls history. Parker Brothers bought the patent, but more importantly, they bought the narrative. They decided which inventor would be famous and which would be forgotten. They wrote history to serve their interests. Charles Darrow's patent might not have been destroyed in a fire, but it survived something more dangerous than fire. It survived the truth. Despite overwhelming evidence that Darrow didn't invent Monopoly, his patent still stands as legal proof that he did. That's more impressive than any fire survival story. That's a document that survived reality itself. So next time you're playing Monopoly, bankrupting your friends, building hotels on Boardwalk, collecting $200 for passing go, remember Elizabeth Magie. Remember the Quaker communities. Remember that you're playing a folk game that got stolen and sold back to the folk. Remember that patents don't always protect the real inventors. Sometimes they protect the people who are best at claiming other people's work. And remember that the most valuable property in Monopoly isn't Park Place or Boardwalk. It's the story itself. Whoever owns the story owns everything. If you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe.